Today on Rooted, we're going to talk about winter pruning the garden. So my garden is composed of a number of different kinds of perennials, small shrubs, annuals, etc. And so we're just going to walk through a number of different examples, talk about what our objectives are with pruning those different types of plants and how to do it correctly. We're going to start with this ornamental grass. There are many kinds of ornamental grasses that will die to the ground and others like this one that basically will stay more or less evergreen. But what I want to do with my ornamental grasses is have them get denser and fuller every single year. And so these are really easy to prune. You want to use a sharp pair of pruners. These are my trusty Felco 11s that I've had for many, many years. The Felco 2s are an industry standard. I like the 11s because they're just a little, I guess lower profile, easy to get into tight spaces with them. So with the ornamental grasses, I just like to take it, a handful at a time. I'm going to cut it back to, it's about a 4 to 6 inch mound left here. Keep my trimmings in a nice little pile so it makes it easier to carry everything back to the compost bin afterwards. All right, so when we're done, we'll have this nice little mounded, round, pruned clump of ornamental grass. So when this sprouts back out, imagine like the way that your turf grass, regrows after you mow it every single time. When this sprouts back out, it's going to be a whole bunch of new leaves. This is going to be a lot denser and fuller. Most of the energy from these leaves has been stored in the root system, so in the spring when this comes back out, it's going to be ready to go. Right next to our ornamental grass, we've got Itea, or Virginia sweetspire, which there's some wonderful cultivars of this that exist now. It's a beautifully fragrant plant. It's a native. This is one called Lantanas. It's so fragrant. It's also super compact, so it only gets about 2 to 3 feet tall. And these are a little leggy, so really all we want to do is bring them back a little bit. We're not going to cut them too much, but we want to set a nice foundation for a really nice thick regrowth of these. So if you notice each one of these little bud sites here, that's where another branch is going to happen. I want to leave about 3 or 4 of these buds so that we get a really nice thick regrowth here. So I'm going to cut these back to where there's maybe about 4 to 5 inches left. And I'm looking to make my cuts just slightly above where there's already an existing bud. So that ensures that I get a nice bud break underneath each one of these cuts. One of my favorite plants in the garden is the rose, and there's so many wonderful landscape and new, more compact, heavy blooming, I think garden-worthy varieties that are coming into the market. This is Purple Prince, which is a wonderful bloomer. You get multiple seasons of bloom out of it, and it typically is going to get about 4 feet tall by 4 feet wide. And you can see this is just, probably the first year or so of growth on these. And they're a little leggy. We want to basically just tighten them up in the same way that we did with the Itea. We're going to come in here and make a number of cuts fairly low, leaving maybe about 5 to 7 buds in each one of these cuts. And we're just reinforcing this kind of domed, round shape that we ultimately want the plant to have. At some point when these are mature and they're, they've achieved more of their 3 foot by 3 foot kind of space, I want them ultimately to be thick up until about right here, where they're not obscuring the view of the front porch, but it's going to develop a nice rose hedge. At that point, we're only going to take a few inches each year off them to just kind of control the height. Right now, though, we're trying to set the foundation of these shrubs to make sure that we got something that's dense and well branched low down on the shrub. Of course, on roses, any dead wood that we find, every now and then you'll find branches that have completely died off. Those we definitely want to remove all the way back to the crown of the plant. So you see, we took this plant that was about, 1.5 feet tall, carved it back into about a 6 to 8 inch mound. So when this flushes back out in the spring, we're gonna have so many wonderful active buds, and it's gonna look like a beautiful ball of foliage. It's gonna have so many more blooms on it, but it also sets the trajectory for the shape of the plant that we want for the long run. With our flowering perennial plants, there are two different broader types I look at in my garden. The ones that go completely dormant, where they basically come back exclusively from the root system, and others that will maintain some live foliage where we're only going to prune back the dead part on the top. So I'm looking at Lantana and Echinacea right here. So these are ones that basically the entirety of the plant's going to go dormant back to the ground. So we're going to take back pretty much all of what we see above ground, because in the summer when these sprout back out, what grows is going to be coming from the crown of the plant. One plant that we get questions on all the time with regards to pruning is the hydrangea. And of course, we don't want to mess up the blooms, and so knowing what kind of hydrangea we have goes a long way in helping us be successful. Whether or not it blooms on new wood or old wood, that's very, very important. Right here we have Little Lime Punch, which is a Paniculata, Hydrangea Paniculata, and so it blooms on new wood. So we're going to go ahead and cut this back now. So it likes to be pruned in the winter and even into like early spring. The blooms are going to come from these new branches that we stimulate by cutting back these stems. I really, really love the tight denseness of Little Lime Punch. From every little branch break, we're going to cut it back to where there's about 3 buds, just maintaining the overall shape. But with every individual little branch, I want to keep about 3 to 4 buds so that we get the maximum amount of new wood and blooms while still maintaining this wonderful round shape that is one of the many reasons why we love Little Lime Punch. With certain deciduous plants, sometimes if we don't know, is this a perennial that dies back all the way to the ground, or is this a shrub like Perovskia, which is also a perennial, but it's more of a shrub form plant. This Perovskia, or Russian sage, it comes back actually from the stems that are established here. So one way to tell, is this a plant that needs to be like, more top pruned or cut off at the ground, even if it's lost all of its leaves, is just to take the edge of our pruner and to scrape one of the stems. And then if it scuffs green, then we can see the stems of this plant are still alive. So one category of perennials that should be particularly easy for us to figure out what we need to do with them from a standpoint of winter pruning are plants like this Monarda and this Coreopsis. We've got a lot of live active green tissue back here at the ground level. You can see on this Coreopsis here, there's just the dead seed heads. So basically all we're going to do is we're going to remove the plant material back, the dead, dormant plant material, back to the leafy greens down here. And so this is just a little light haircut, and all we're basically doing is pruning away these dead seed heads. On the Monarda, kind of the same thing. We've got some new foliage happening back in here. These are the old tops from the past season. Some of them still have leaves on them, but that's okay. We're going to prune this back into like just a nice tight mound. We're moving into the old stems that exist there, like I said, just getting back into these new leaves. And this is, of course, what's going to, as soon as it gets warm, these are all the new stems that are going to pop up and give us a new perennial shrub and all the new flowers. So that's just a few easy tips and tricks from a standpoint of pruning the winter garden. There's of course a lot to learn about pruning, but remember this, like even if you mess it up, it's a plant. In most cases, it's gonna grow out of it. And I think one of the most important things to think about, especially if it's a plant that is gonna grow back from the branches and the material that we see above ground, think about the shape of the plant that you want ultimately and what you're trying to accomplish with that plant in your garden. Sometimes we prune more aggressively if we're trying to subdue its growth, or if we want more of a wild natural look, maybe we don't prune it at all. So part of pruning too is just what your natural personality is, what you want that plant to do in your garden. With the plants that die all the way to the ground, those are the no-brainers. Just go ahead and trim them off at the soil level. There's a lot to learn, but there's also some pretty simple tips and tricks when it comes to pruning.